Hey there, this is Dan at the Salty Sea, and I've been playing a whole lot of Warcry lately. I've been having a great time with the game, so I thought I'd try and share that with a video series of deep dives on the various Warcry warbands I've been playing. I'm going to start with Demons of Khorne. So first, some quick background on the faction. If you're coming to this game from some other Warhammer product, you'll know who Khorne is, but if not, he's one of the main Warhammer villains, and he's modeled after the classic hellish demon archetype you might find in, Dante's Inferno or some old religious thing. He's one of the four Chaos gods, and maybe the one with the fewest redeeming characteristics. His whole thing is just Bloodbath City. He feeds on violence, his followers are humans turned into monsters by their worship of him, and if they commit enough violent atrocities, Khorne's demons are summoned to join in. That's this faction, the Demons. They're Khorne's infernal will made manifest, and they live only for rage, slaughter, and violence. So if that's their background, what are they like to play? Well, their rules reflect the background pretty well. This warband always wants to be fighting. Every unit is statted to not mind being in the thick of melee combat, but their abilities, they're really just straightforward and meant for creating fights. You're not going to be creating a ton of little tricksy I gotcha plays with this faction. Not that that means this faction is just a mindless slugfest. Each unit fulfills its role really well, but it can take you a long time to really master how to put them in their roles and how to put them in places to succeed. They have a narrow model range, which gives you fewer options. And when I say they aren't tricksy, what I really mean is they don't have any ranged, flying, or support units, so you don't have a lot of combos. You're going to have to use a lot of finesse to win objective missions, or any scenario where your opponents can get to where they need to go without having to fight through you to get there. So let's start talking about the actual troops themselves, the ones you're going to be pushing around the table. Before we do, I just want to make a note on some math hammering that I like to do with these guys. Now, I really like math hammer, but I'm going to just keep it down to just 4 ratings. You don't have to worry too much about the math. I'll put that up on the screen, and I'm totally happy to talk about it in the comments with anyone. But really just what I'm looking for is a single digit number that's easy to read and that represents one of these 4 characteristics that I care about with a unit. One is just how much damage does it do for its points. Another is how survivable is it for its points. Another is how well does it project power or damage across the board. And the last one I call sort of forechecking. It happens a lot in this game where you need to play defense aggressively. So you need to go after the opponent, and it doesn't matter as much if you take them out as it matters that they can't take you out while you get into an aggressive position in their territory. So now to go on to Bloodletters. These guys are sort of the bread and butter of any Khorne force. That's true in other Warhammer games, and it's true in this one as well. They do very high damage for their points. So their damage efficiency of 9.9 is one of the highest in the games. But they're very slow, and they're pretty fragile as well. So point for point, they're the real damage engine in the warband. But positioning is going to be really important with them. You really don't want to find yourself sort of double moving them onto an objective to have an opponent just take them out in one activation easily, and then they never got to get their chops in. These guys their damage profile is very heavy on the critical hits, so while they sometimes lose the battle with other chaff units if those units get to fight first, they're very good at melting armored opponents. They do essentially the same amount of damage to Stormcast that they would to, just about every other unit in the game. So that can be really important. You're going to want to put them in places where your opponent needs to go through them. That way they can focus on attacking and they don't have to double move. So you really want to place them in places where you can force your opponent to think twice before double moving into your territory. So then we get to Blood Crushers. Blood Crushers are just bloodletters who climb on top of these sweet mechanical rhinos and charge into battle. They do much less damage for their points, but per model it's still pretty reasonable. And low damage efficiency for Khorne at 5.6 would still actually be a pretty average output in a lot of other warbands. Their mobility is pretty good. Certainly not on par with some of the warbands that are flying all over the place, but at 6 inches per movement, they can get across the board. But what's really valuable about them is how resilient they are. I gave them a tank rating of 8.4, and that's really high. That resilience, that 30 hit points on 4 toughness, along with their ability called Murderous Charge, which is a version of an ability that a lot of other warbands have, where you get to deal damage equal to your dice roll to whatever units you end up moving on to engage into a fight. They use that ability better than most of the ones who have it, because they're pretty quick, but they're also resilient. So it gives you sort of this freedom to just double move onto enemies without the fear that they're just going to delete you the second you stop. So you can go tie up important high damage targets, or you can get into choke points. This is where what I talked about with forechecking, the hockey term, comes into play, where these guys are great at playing defense in an aggressive position. They're big bases, again, will block off choke points, or you can use them to zone out objectives to stop the opponent from taking control. Their high hit points and just high survivability makes it so that if you put them on the other side of an objective where an opponent has to either get around them to get into scoring position or chop through them, it can be really difficult for your opponent. Finally, we get to Fleshhounds, which are my favorite unit. They're the good boys of the Khorne army. Now, they do, for Khorne, medium damage and they have medium resilience, but remember, this is a warband where every unit is statted to be in combat. So medium melee combat stats for Khorne are still high for other units or for other warbands. But also, again, for Khorne, they have very high mobility, which means that they're the objective grabbers in the offense or in the warband. Their ability Hungry for Flesh means that Fleshhounds, they're not going to win the race to the objective, because what it does is it says that if there's a visible unit within 6 inches, they get to take another movement action to get closer to that unit. Now, sometimes the competitive gamer in you reads an ability like that and says, oh, well, I could actually go past that unit and not attack it and go somewhere else. And that's true. You can do that, and it can be useful. But really, it's actually much better to just use it how it reads, where the Fleshhounds won't always win the race to the objective. Most warbands have an objective grabber who's faster than them, but they can absolutely win the fight once they get there. So that makes them really powerful in the kill one fighter missions, or say whoever wins is the one who destroys the dagger of the other warband. The reason they're so good in those missions is because in Warcry, half the missions, those ones in particular, the objective is a unit. So this gives you a huge threat range. So normally their 8-inch move would get them 16 inches in 2 movements, but here you can get to 14 inches and attack once you get there, which is great. So even though they're not as resilient as the Blood Crushers, they're, again, relative fragility, because they don't just fold to a stiff breeze, is offset by their greater ability to pick their fights across the board. So who's going to lead this motley collection of infernal blood demons? Well, you get 3 options. Now my favorite is the Gorehound. You can see mine in the bottom left there. These guys do an incredible amount of damage to toughness 3 things, over 9. So they can often take out a chaff unit in just 1 activation. This makes them great at projecting power, because combined with their mobility, if they decide that they're going to take out a given unit, no amount of screening is really going to stop them for long, which is really useful for all of the hunter-killer missions. They also have an ability called Burning Roar, so that even if they do get tied up in combat, they can actually hit their target with the ability damage from far away. Burning Roar is a single target burn spell that I'll talk about in the next slide. But in the meantime, there are still two other leaders that are worth consideration. The first is the Blood Hunter. It costs the same amount as the Gorehound at 240 points. And it has pretty good combat stats, arguably better than the Gorehounds. It has the same incredible damage efficiency and the same ability to take out chaff units in just one swing. But it has an even better tank score because it's got 5 more HP. Now, one thing to recognize with the Blood Hunter is that the Murderous Charge ability, which is so good on Blood Crushers, is also good on the Blood Hunter, but it doesn't give you any bigger bonus than for a normal Blood Crusher. So I like to use the smaller ones for those roles. Finally, there's the Blood Reaper. It's the cheapest of the three at 150 points, so it gives you more room for other troops. And it's really aggressively costed, just like Bloodletters are. 8.7 damage efficiency is really high for a leader. But it has really poor mobility, and at least personally, I worry about putting leaders in positions where the opponent gets to choose who's fighting them. Another thing to mention, though, is that for a Decapitating Strike, the Bloodletter ability, Blood Reapers get a slightly bigger bonus from it, since they have 5 attacks instead of 4. So now that we've been talking about these abilities, let's actually go through them, and how you might use them to build your lists for your warbands. Now, one of the central cores of the game is sort of abilities versus activations. Cheaper costed units just get more activations per point, right? 10 100 cost units get to do more things than 5 200 cost units get to do. So that can actually be a pretty big bonus that adds up quickly over time. But luckily, elites get much more benefit from each ability. Now, at the beginning of the round, you just roll your dice, and whatever your abilities are, that's how many you get. So it doesn't matter if you have 10 people or 5, you still get the same number of abilities. But using one that says, say, this activation is going to do a lot more damage, does a lot more percentage-wise when you're putting it on an elite. So you get diminishing returns both to flooding the board with chaff, or just concentrating on 2 or 3 elite units. It's one of the sort of underneath mechanics of the game that I really like. So let's talk about the ones specific to Khorne demons. First, there's Decapitating Strike. You get to add half the value of the ability to the damage points allocated by crits just for the next attack action, and it has to be a melee attack. It only works for the Bloodletters, but it can be pretty good. The average is only 1 1/3, but this swinginess to the ability, because it really just modifies crits, can mean that for desperate attacks, you give your Bloodletter a fighting chance to take out an elite unit that would otherwise just easily mow down your Bloodletter. Then on to Murderous Charge. It's an ability that lets you deal damage equal to the dice roll to any enemies that you end up 1 inch from at the end of your movement. So it uses your engage move to add some charge damage to your enemy. A lot of warbands have this, but not every warband makes as good use of it as we do, since the Blood Crusher is both mobile and tanky. Finally, there's Burning Roar, which is the quad. Now, Burning Roar picks a visible enemy fighter within 8 inches and rolls a number of dice equal to the value of the ability. And for just a 2-up, you get to do 2 damage points for that fighter. So on average, and I know no one ever rolls a 3.5, but the average on a d6 is 3.5. The average 3.5 gets you, again, an average of 5.83 damage, which is quite a bit. It makes it so you really want to do late game planning with this warband so that you can end round 3 of a tight combat with a Burning Roar. That can really help you take out any fighter that you really need to clean up by the end of the match. Finally, just some other ones to make note of. There's Blood for the Blood God, where if you take something down, you get to make another move or another attack action for the cost of a double. Almost every warband has access to this somewhere. However, Khorne gets to use it for every single unit, which is really nice. Then there's the Hungry for Flesh, where a fighter can use the ability only if a visible enemy is within 6 inches, but they get to make a bonus move action. Like I mentioned in the Fleshhound section, that can be really useful. So let's get to lists. Now, in a lot of strategy games, balance isn't always the best thing you can be doing. A lot of strategy games have the best strategy eventually being focusing on one thing that you do really well and really committing to it. That might be true in Warcry as well. However, I think you'll have a lot of fun with a balanced list, like the one on the right, where you start with the Gorehound so that you can use that quad, which is so useful. And then you end up with 2 of every unit type, plus a final Bloodletter. So a Fleshhound, 2 Blood Crushers, and 3 Bloodletters. I found this list works really well because each unit does its role excellently, and they complement each other really well. However, if you want, you can try something based on the list on the left. You can fit 1 Blood Reaper, which is the Bloodletter hero, along with 12 Bloodletters for an entirely aggressively costed Bloodletter force. Now, sometimes this is just going to fold immediately, but you could have opponents who just can't deal with just the sheer weight of numbers for how much damage you get out of Bloodletters for what their points cost. Finally, if you want to be competitive, it might be worth testing something in between, where you use the aggressive costs of the Bloodletters, but you also include 1 of each of the other unit types so that you can at least get the abilities. I personally like to have multiples of each one so that I can, let's call it, use the roles in different places on the field at different times. And then finally, with everything I've said, keep in mind you don't actually have to use the Gorehound in your games. The power of Burning Roar is really amazing, but quads are unreliable, so I can see deciding to skip it. Finally, the Blood Hunter and 4 Blood Crushers, that's the true meme list. Just roll triple every round and you'll be fine. It'll be great. So there it is. Khorne, Demons, and Warcry. Let me know what you think in the comments, especially if you've tried this warband out or if you're thinking about trying it out later. I'm thinking about doing videos like this for some other warbands, so let me know which ones you like, and if I have a way to play with them, I'll try it out and do another deep dive. Until then, may all your rolls be crits.